So guys, when you are developing any kind of real-time application, or you can say whenever you are developing any product, so in technically you can say any software. So minimum three things that what you need to take into consideration. What are the thing? Whatever problem you are solving, that is the business functionality. So whatever reason, right, for what software you are developing, that functionality should right satisfy. I mean, whatever functionality that must be there. The second thing that what you need to take into consideration is performance. So for performance, so what we need to use right different techniques, caching. You need to check your queries, right? Whatever queries you are written, whether they have right written in an optimized way or not. So that is the second thing. The third thing is security. If any of this is not satisfied, right? For example, if you are developing one application, that application taking more time, then no one is going to use. If there is no security, then no one is going to use your product. And 100%, if you are developing any banking application, e-commerce application, then that main objective should be there. If that you are developing one banking application which is not working as expected, so I'm adding the money, but that money is not showing in my account. I'm sending some money. That money deducted from my account, but not credited to my right friend's account. So that should not be the case. So whatever the business functionality, that should handle by your code. But at the same time, two more things that what you need to take into consideration. One is performance, 100%. Your application should give good performance. Second one is going to be security. Security means, right, your application should provide best security so that the client, the customer, the user, they can trust your application. So today and in our few upcoming sessions, we are going to keep focus on this security part. So today I will discuss you what is security, what is authentication, what is authorization, how you can write, what are the different types of authentications are there, what is basic authentication, what is role-based authentication. We are also going to discuss what is token-based authentication, how we can implement token-based authentication with JWT, how we can also implement refresh token, how we can implement role-based authentication, claim-based authentication. All these things we are going to discuss today and in our few upcoming sessions. So let us first understand what is authentication, authorization, why we need authentication and authorization in our web API. See, in today's digital world, most applications, right? Whatever application you take into consideration. For example, banking application, shopping platform, learning portal, healthcare system, right? Any social media application, right? Any social media like LinkedIn, Facebook, like Twitter, Instagram, any kind of applications you take into consideration, they rely on web APIs to exchange the data and perform the operations. So, what exactly it means? It means now a particular product we have different applications. For example, if you take the example of a Facebook, or if you take the example of any banking applications, they are not only providing the web-based application, but also they are providing some kind of Android application, some kind of iOS applications. But at the same time, for internal communication, they might be creating some kind of a desktop application, some kind of a IoT application. So many kind of applications are there. And whenever the application wants to, right, sometimes what happen, we are defining one application, my application wants to communicate with the other application. For example, if you take any, right, uh, e-commerce application, right, on your application, you want to provide the flight booking functionality. But that flight booking functionality or the API or whatever the data I'm getting from ClearTip. So my application consuming some third-party application. So any kind of application, right, you take into consideration. If you want to exchange the data, I mean, I'm sending some data, I'm getting some data, or if I want to perform some application, creating one order, creating one payment, right? Confirming the order, getting the user details, any kind of operations you take into consideration, the data that is going to be exchanged is in the form of a web APIs only. So that is what you need to make sure, right? And whatever web API we develop, it is going to exchange the data. And when it is going to exchange the data, it might be going to send and receive some sensitive informations, sensitive informations like personal details, financial data, health related data, business data, right? Many kind of sensitive information. It is also going to expose. As web API, so whenever we are developing web API means what? It is going to exchange the data over the internet. So as it is exchanging the data over the internet, so they become a common target for the attackers, right? So any hacker or any attacker, they can target this data whenever you are exchanging the data over the internet. If the API, whatever we develop, if they are not secured, if we are not providing security to our API, then what will happen? Now, whatever the sensitive data we are sending or we are exchanging, it might be your personal information, it might be your financial information, it might be your health related information that can be exposed to the attacker. Attacker may perform some unauthorized action. For example, instead of creating one record, the attacker modify the data and modify the query, it is going to update something else. So whatever the data I'm sending, that data exposed to the attacker, that data is going to be modified by the attacker, or even right instead of sending any update request, it might be get the data, he can send the delete request, which is going to delete the data in the database. So the overall, if your security is not there, so your data is not secured, right? That means what the trust as a client, as a user, as a customer, I cannot trust your application. And if the customer doesn't trust your application, that means your application brand value is going to be reduced, and that can also make damage to the organization. So the point that what you need to remember, security is not a technical requirement as it today. In today's digital world, security is not optional; it is mandatory. So if you are developing a simple application, also if it exposing the data over the internet, means what? You have to provide security. Without security, no one in the world going to use your applications. And the good thing is that to provide security, right? We are provided with two important concepts. What are the concepts? Authentication and authorization. So what is authentication? Authentication is all about identity. Authentication is all about identity. So, what do you mean by identity? Identity means it is going to ensure, or authentication is going to ensure that the system knows who is making the request. If I'm sending a request to the system, then the system know me. The system identify, yes, this request is coming from Pranay, that request is coming from Sam, that request is coming from Sam, whatever. So this means what? Now, as a user, as a customer, as a client, I need to provide my identity, and that identity I can provide in different form. So how? Now I can provide username and password. I can provide in the form of OTP. I will provide my email or a right mobile number. The system will send one OTP, and that OTP I need to enter. It can be in the form of a biometric data. I can scan my fingerprint, scan my IG. So that identity you can provide in many different ways. So that is nothing but your authentication. Authentication going to identify whether the user is a valid user for the application or not. And then how it can validate? Now for that purpose, as a customer, as a client, and a user, you need to tell that who are you. So you need to give your identity. You need to give your right authentication details to the server. Then, sir, what about authorization? Authorization is all about access. As a user, once you identified, once the system validated, once the system verified that you are a valid user, then within the application, what are the page you can access? What are the operations you can perform? Right? What are the action method or what are the APIs you can access? Right? That what is going to defined by the authorization. So every user, every client, every customer is going to be associated with some kind of roles and permissions, and based on the roles and permissions, right, the system is going to decide whether the user can access that particular resource or not. This is not clear at the moment. We are going to discuss all this concept technically. We are going to discuss this concept programmatically as well as theoretically along with some real-time scenario. Is that clear why we need authentication and authorization?
Yes.
Clear, guys?
Yes.
Okay. So this is just
Yes.
a introduction. Now we need to understand what is authentication or how does the authentication work. So first of all, right, authentication means authentication means it identify who the user is. As a user, am I authenticated to access the application or not? That is going to define by the authentication. To understand this thing, please look at this right diagram. Let's assume we are using username and password based right logic, right? Password based. So basically, what I need to do, As a customer, as a user, as a client, you can take any terminology. Sometimes the client is, sometimes it can be a client, sometimes it can be a customer, right? Any terminology you can use. As a client, as a customer, what I need to do, I need to provide my credential. So credential means what? Now one login page will open where I need to enter my username or email ID and password. Sometimes what happens, you need to provide your, right, what I can say, only username or email ID. The system will send one OTP to the email ID and right phone number if the user is registered. Sometimes you can go with the fingerprint scanning. Any kind of right, uh, I mean, application you take into consideration. As a customer, first you need to provide your credential. Right, assume we are providing this credential through a login page. So the right page will take the username and password, and it will send a request to the system. I mean to the server. In this case, what the server is going to do, now once it receives the username and password, it is going to check, right? Username, it is going to be unique. Most of the time, it is going to be your email ID. So what the system is going to do, the system is going to check whether this email or username is available in the database. Yes, it is available in the database. Okay, if it is available, let me figure out what is the associated password. And most importantly, guys, remember, we never ever store the password in plain text. If you take any kind of a database where you are storing the user details, password should and must be always not encrypted, not plain text. It must be hashed. Why? If you are storing in the form of encrypted, you can easily decrypt the password. So for encryption, there is a decryption mechanism. But for hashing, there is no reverse mechanism. Means what? Now, if I am having one string, if I am generating one hash value, then from that hash value, I can never generate what is the actual string. That is not possible. But if you are using encryption means you can encrypt the data, and that encrypted data again can be converted back to decryption. So when it comes to password is never going to be stored either in the plain text or in encrypted format. How it is going to store? You have to store that password using some hashing algorithm like SHA-256, SHA-512, right? So the algorithm you need to use to store the password. So in this case, but here from the user, what it is sending the password in plain text. But in the database, that password is stored in hash format. What the server first it will do, first it will check whether this username is available in the database. Yes, it is available. Then what is the hashed password? So it will retrieve the password hash. Then again what it will do, now whatever the username you provided, for that sorry, whatever the password you provided for that password, again it is going to generate that hash value. So whatever the generated hash value, it is going to compare with the hashed password hash value that is stored in the database. If you both are matched, that means your authentication is successful. And once the authentication is successful, user granted access. If the authentication failed, whether the username is invalid or right, even though username is valid, a password doesn't match, then in that case, the system is going to return 401 unauthorized or access denied. Access rejected. Clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. Now let us try to understand this, right, with one real-time application. For example, so if you are working in a company, you are working in the organization. So if you are going to enter into the company campus, first of all, you need to identify yourself that you are the person working in this company. How you will identify? Now, in the security gate or in the entrance, there might be sometime right biometrics, right? You have to scan your finger, right? Scan means you have temporary fingerprint. The system is going to scan whether you are a valid employee for this organization or not. And that biometric scanning, what is happening at the entrance, this is nothing but your authentication. Clear?
Yes.
Right. So this is what we discussed till now is authentication, right? Then what is authorization? Authorization comes after authentication. So authorization comes after authentication. Once the user is authenticated, means once the system validated that the user is a authenticated user, then authorization come into the picture. Then what exactly the authorization will going to do, and or what it decide? Now, authorization is the process that determines what an already authenticated user is permitted to do within the system. Once the system know who the user is, that is authentication part, authorization decide what the user allowed to do within the system. It's all about permission and access control. Sir, what do you mean by permissions and access control? Now, it means based on the permission level or based on the access control level, authorization is going to answer you few questions. Which features the user can use? Which pages or API the user can access? What type of operation the user can do? Right? For example, whether this user access to admin related pages, whether the user allowed to do insert, update, and delete operation. So what are the different pages the user is allowed to do? So all these things are going to be decided by authorization, right? So let us try to understand how it is going to work. First of all, right, you can say the user provides the username and permissions, right? The user provides the username and permissions, and let assume the user is verified, right? So system verified user logs in with username and password, and the system verified that this username and password are correct. So once the username and password are correct, means what? That the authentication part is done. So the authentication, the system identify that this particular user is a valid user. Then in the next step, what we need to do? Now for this particular user, we need to check, right, what all roles and permissions are assigned. So again, in the database, we need to store what are the associated roles for this user has, whether the user is an admin user, whether the user is a manager, whether the user is a normal user, does this user having more than one roles or permissions. So all these roles and permissions, it is going to retrieve from the database. So once it is retrieved from the database, then whatever page, whatever the resource or whatever endpoint the user trying to access, it is going to check this authorization checks is going to be happen. So what exactly this authorization check is going to do? The authorization check going to decide for this particular action method, the permission is admin. And for this particular user, the permission is, the role is manager. So for this action method, role admin is required, and this user, whoever trying to access this action method, the role manager is right assigned. Then what exactly it is going to do? It is going to fail the request. It is going to decide no, as a manager role, as a manager user, you cannot access admin right resources. So in that case, what exactly it is going to do? It is going to return access denied, and with what type of error message? 403 forbidden. Forbidden means you do not have permission to access this resource. But at the same time, if the user is an admin user and the resource what he is trying to access, for that that is decorated with admin role, then in that case, the authorization check pass and he can access the resource. So basically, the step one authentication, then it is going to retrieve all the associated role based on the assigned role, and whatever the roles is required for that action method, it is going to rate it to the authorization check. If access is if permission is allowed, he can access the resource, otherwise he will get 403 forbidden access. Clear?
Yes.
Clear or okay? Now if you look at the same example, right, once you right identify your identity with the fingerprint or with the scanner, right, then you can enter the office campus. But can you access every places, every right section within the campus? As a normal user, can you access the server room? No, you cannot access the server room, right? But can you access the work area, cafeteria? Yes, you can access the work area, cafeteria. Can you access the HR room? No. So basically, right, how it is going to decide which section you can access, which section you cannot access based on the roles and right responsibility. If you are a normal developer or normal tester, you don't have as a normal tester, or you don't have any work in the server room, so you are restricted. So for this server room, what if you have permission, you can enter. If you don't have permission, you cannot enter. So once you enter inside the campus, then based your role and responsibility will decide which section you can access, which section you cannot access, and that is nothing but your authorization. Authorization will decide which pages, which resources you can access, what type of operations you can do or you cannot do. That is going to defined by the authorization mechanism. Clear?
Yes.
Right now, so what are the different types of authentication and authorization? So basically, in real-time application, you can go with this basic authentication. This is not needed nowadays. Nowadays, no one is using basic authentication. But from the learning point of view, you should start with the basic authentication. The second one, right nowadays, people are using is token-based authentication, popularly known as JWT, JSON Web Token. That is what you will learn. And the third one is OAuth or OpenID Connect. That is right. Most of the time, you can see some of the application they want to log in using your existing account. For example, Google authentication, Facebook authentication, Microsoft authentication. Right. Some external authentication you can also use. So that is nothing but your OAuth or OpenID Connect. So these three types of authentication is required. So for time being, what I'm going to discuss, I'm going to discuss this basic authentication. I'm going to discuss this is token-based or JWT authentication. And this OAuth and OpenID Connect we'll discuss later. Why I'm saying I will discuss this later, the reason is, so this basic authentication and token-based authentication, I can test using Postman, Fiddler, and something like this, Swagger. But for this one, OpenID and OAuth, you need a user interface. Without any kind of user interface, you cannot test this functionality. So once you understand, once you learn Angular, at that time I will show you what should be the front end part and how it will communicate with your backend database for right this OpenID Connect. So for now, we are going to use these two authentication. Once you start Angular, then I will discuss you this external authentication. Is that clear?
Yes. Okay.
Right. Now, now
Yes.
let us now let us proceed. Anyone having any question before moving to basic authentication, how it work, the architecture example? Anyone having any question related to what is authentication, what is authorization, right? Why do you have both authentication and authorization, right? How authentication authorization works? Any layman understandable example? Is that clear? Or what are the different types of authentication mechanisms? Is that clear?
Pranay, I have one question.
Yes, please.
Uh, Hello, I am audible?
Yeah, yeah, you are audible.
Yeah, Pranay, sometimes when we heard the authentication related terminology, we heard about the user claims. So, what is that
We'll discuss.
user
We'll
claim?
discuss, right? So whatever your
Yeah,
query, right? Not your many people are having such queries, right? So I
yeah.
have right, I have created one FAQ session, right? So at the end, I'm providing all these informations, right? That is FAQs.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
right FAQs. So let me show you. So whatever, right? This is expected because right when I start learning, I also felt the same things, right? So what are the
Yeah.
things, right? So I'm starting here. You can see FAQ session. So what problems we are solving with authentication and authorization? What is authentication scheme? What is this add authentication attribute? What is authenticate challenge and forbid? Right? What does this authentication, basic authentication handler, who is responsible for reading the authentication header and validating credential? What are claims? What are identity, or you can say claims identity? What is claims principal? What is HTTP context dot user? Right? All these things. What is the use of this use authentication middleware component? What is the use of this use authorization middleware component? Right? Definitely 100% at the end of the session, you will get the clarity. I'm not going to touch this right question answer, but practically I'm going to explain this thing while I'm giving the example so that 100% you will get the clarity what exactly all these things right technically. Clear?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pranay.
So this is mandatory, right? Because this question, right, even right, people are working with me, having 15 years of experience, they even don't have any idea. They are working, they are developing, but they don't know what exactly, right, these things are internally or technically, right? So let us proceed and try to understand. basic authentication, right, step by step. So basic authentication means what, Kanna? It is one of the oldest and the simplest authentication mechanism, right? For implementing basic authentication, you do not need to do a lot of hard work. It's very simple and easily you can implement, right? So in this case, what is happening? Now, it secure an API or HTTP service by requiring the client to send a username and password with every request. So basically, what exactly it means? It means if you are using basic authentication, then in each and every request for which authentication is required, the client needs to pass the username and password in every request. So instead of right, maintaining sessions and issuing tokens, so there is no concept of a token, there is no concept of sessions. Even for WebAP, session concept is not there. For MVC-based application, session and cookies are there. But for WebAP, there is no session, no right, concept of cookies. But yes, JWT token or token-based authentication is there. With basic authentication, it's completely rely on the username and the password, which as a developer, as a user, you need to pass in each and every request to the server. So in this case, credential means username and password are sent with every HTTP request. No session state is maintained by the server. Server even in case of JWT authentication, token-based authentication, server is not going to remember the client information. It is very easy to implement and understand. And 100% if you are using right basic authentication, your services should run on HTTPS for security. Right? Why it is important to implement HTTPS, I will also show you practically. So let us try to understand how basic authentication works. Right. So definitely as a client, you need to send the credential, but how the credential is going to send? So can I send this credential in plain text? No. You right, in case of a basic authentication, you should take the username and password, but you should not send this credential right as it is to the server. So if I'm not sending this as it is, then how I can pass? And you have to prepare one encoded base 64 string, and that string you need to pass. For example, this is my username, color, whatever the password, that is going to be my string. Then I want to convert that string into base 64 encoded string, and that base 64 encoded string I need to pass in the authorization header with the schema basic. So what is authorization header, what is schema, how to pass, practically I'm going to show you, right? If you are wondering, right, how it should be looks like, right, you can see. So this is my authorization. This is my schema basic, which is going to tell I'm using basic authentication. Right? For other, if you are using token-based authentication, the schema is going to be bearer. And this is nothing but my base 64 encoded string. And this string, right? Why I'm sending this one? Because it is only going to contain string. Sometimes what happens now, you are using some right special character. You are using some special symbol, alphabet, digit, right? Some space. Many things you can include within the password, which cannot be travel as it is right in the over the internet. So to make this information as a valid string, right? What I'm doing, what generally basic authentication saying. Now please create a base 64 encoded string. Pass that in the authorization header using the schema basic. So that's what you need to do, right? I will show you how you can do this thing. So once you pass this thing, right? Once you pass that authenticated, right, encoded credential in the authorization header using the basic right authentication scheme, the server receives the request. The server first right check whether the authorization header is there. So if you are implementing basic authentication, authorization header is mandatory. So it will check the authorization header. It will check what is the whether that authorization header contains the basic authentication scheme or not. If it contains the basic authentication scheme, then what is the associated encoded string? So it will fetch that encoded string. It will decode that encoded string so that it can get the email and the password. Once it get the email and password, it will verify the credential against the database, right? Once it verify the credential, if the credentials are valid, it will give access so that you can access the application. If it is invalid, then you will get 401 unauthorized error. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right? But in this case, because we have any step for authorization, we are only validating, right, whether the credential are valid or not in the database. That means authorization is not coming here. So this is simply basic authentication without authorization. Now how the authorization will come into the picture? Now authorization will come into the picture means, right? We need to add additional step, right? How we can add that step? Now, first of all, the user will provide a, right, invoke this API endpoint. It will pass the authorization header, right, with the basic authentication scheme. The server decode the right, basic authentication, validate the user credential. Once the user is valid, that means authentication is done. It is going to retrieve the user roles. If authentication failed, it will return 401 unauthorized access from here. But if authentication is done, right, once the user is valid, then it is going to retrieve the user's roles from the database, whatever roles are associated with the user. Then it is going to do the authorization check. It is going to check if the user has required role to access the particular resource or not. If it has the required role, then access is granted. Otherwise, in this case, it is going to return 403. So what is the difference between 401 and 403? 401 tells the client that the credential what you provided is invalid. You take the credential. 403, what it is going to tell to the client, the credential what you provided is correct. But whatever the resources you are trying to access is not valid. You cannot access those resources. Please check with the admin why you are not accessing after, why you are not unable or why you are unable to access those resources. For that purpose, you can go ahead and check with the admin team. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Anyone having any
Yes.
question? Okay. Now, now what I'm going to do, I'm going to develop one complete, not a complete real-time application, but complete authentication application. So authentication application means what? How you can implement basic authentication in a real-time application. That's what I am going to develop step by step with the database, with the actual logic as per the industry standard. That's what I'm going to discuss now. So let us proceed and first develop one application. So let me go ahead and create one project with authentication demo. So go to the Visual Studio, open your Visual Studio, create a new project. So once you create the project, as I'm going to interact with the SQL Server database using Entity Framework or Code First approach, so I need to install the required packages. So whichever packages are compatible with .NET 8, those packages version I'm installing. If I'm not specifying that package version, it is going to install .NET 10, sorry, Entity Framework Core 10, which is not compatible with the .NET 8. So explicitly, I'm specifying that please install the package version 8. So first of all, this is the Entity Framework core package. The second one, what I'm going to install is the database provider, right? Is database provider package for SQL Server. And the third one is going to be your migration package. Using this, right, once you install this package, then what you can do, you can create, right, all this thing. All this thing means you can you execute add migration command, you can execute update database command. So those command you can execute now. Now let us proceed and create our models or entities, right, for which we want to create a table in the database. So first of all, create one folder. Let me. So I have created one folder for models. I will create one folder for DTOs. I will create one folder for right what I can say DP context, and I will create one folder for handlers, right, where I am going to implement my basic authentication. What is handlers? I will come to this part. So and right, I'm also going to create one folder called a helper. So this helper method, helper means I'm going to create some class file which is going to do the right what I can say, which is going to generate the password hash, which is going to compare the password. So for that purpose, I'm going to create one helper class. So these are the different folder that what I need in my application. So first of all, I'm going to create one entity called role entity. So whatever roles are there within the application, within the system, those roles I'm going to store within a master table. That table name I'm going to give as roles, and here the entity name is going to be role entity. And as part of this table, I'm going to store whatever the role ID you need, right? Whatever the role name, any description you want to provide. And this role and user, right? Guys, remember one user can have a multiple role and one role can be assigned to multiple users. So the relationship between user and role is going to be many to many. And for that purpose, right, I'm going to create one mapping table, that table name, right? If I do not provide this, automatically one table is going to be generated by the system. But I want to handle, right? I want everything to be done manually. So I'm going to create this user role mapping table manually. So that's what I have specified here. The next entity is going to be user entity. So the user, nothing but the user who is trying to, right, access the resources within my application. So let me go ahead and create the user table. So in this user table, you can see I'm having the user ID, full name, email, and here you can see password has. That password I'm going to store in the form of a, right, what I can say, uh, in the form of a has. So is active. So I'm adding another property called is active to identify whether the user is active or not. So ID, full name, email, password is active. So guys, remember later on once we start Angular, I'm going to discuss email confirm functionality, two-factor authentication. Many things are there which we will elaborate once we start the UI part, but not now. So now this is the right class file what I'm going to use. So again, one user can have associated with multiple roles. So there is a collection property here. So let me put this here, is active. Then the next one is user role. This is going to be the mapping table where I'm going to create one composite primary key and two foreign keys. Each foreign key will point to the user and the right roles table, and those foreign keys are also going to be my composite primary key. So composite primary key I'm going to create using user ID and role ID, and this is also going to be created as a foreign key because of this navigation property. Clear? So then the last entity, what I'm going to do, product entity. So basically this product entity means on this entity, I'm going to perform the CRUD operation. So basically I'm going to show you how I can perform the CRUD operation without authentication, with basic authentication, right? With basic authentication, with role, right? I can assign multiple roles. Any role if the user has, he can access both role. I'm also going to design some endpoint. For that endpoint, the user should have two roles, that is the and condition. That is what I'm also going to decide, right? So basically five different operations I'm going to perform and on the product entity. So that is what, right, and those operations I'm going to define in my service class. So again, I'm going to create services. So also create that folder that is going to be services. So this is my product ID, name, description, price and stock. Clear? These entities are clear. Clear, guys? Anyone
Yes.
have any question? So this is going to be our mapping table that right, the user role mapping information it is going to store. And why I'm making this as a composite primary key? Because the combination of a duplicate I don't want to allow. So that is the reason why. Now what I'm going to do, as you can see, that the user password I'm going to store in the form of a hash. Why I'm using hash? Right, in the interview, the interviewer might be asked you how we are going to store the password in the database. Do I need to store the password in plain text? Do I need to store the password in encrypted format? Do I need to generate a hash of that password and store that hash in the database? What is the best approach and why? So you have to tell, first of all, plain text is not acceptable. Anyone can see. Secondly, encryption is not required because once the user know what encryption algorithm is being used, he can decrypt the password. The best approach is password hash. Why? Because there is the reverse process is not possible. Once the password hash is generated, from that hash password, you can never generate what is the actual password. So for that purpose, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a password hasher helper class. And this password helper class is going to do two things. First of all, it is going to generate a password hash based on the plain text, plain password, it will generate the password hash. Second, it is going to compare the password and it is going to tell whether the password is right matched or not. So for that purpose, what I'm going to do within the helpers folder, I'm going to create one class file. That class file name is password hasher. Guys, remember this is one of the fundamental rule because right as generally when people are starting learning, they are storing the password in plain text, right? You never do this thing. So now what I'm doing here, I'm using one algorithm. So I'm using SAR 256. If you want a bigger hash, then you can also make use of SAR 502. Right? Whatever, right? 256 or 502, right? So that what you can use. Anyone is fine. So if you are going with the 256, that is also fine. Right. So first of all, what I'm going to do here, please observe, I'm creating one right SAR 256 instance. Then whatever the plain text is provided, see this hash password, it is going to convert this plain text string to a hash based right string. So first of all, I'm creating an instance of a SAR256. Then whatever the plain text is right, I'm receiving, I'm converting that plain text to a byte array. Why? Because password is going to be hash, right? If I'm right, computing the hash value, right, that hash is going to be generated from the byte array, right? So in this case, that byte array, I'm converting the password into byte array. Then by taking that byte array, I'm computing the right hash, and then I'm converting that hash to right, converting that byte array hash to a base 64 encoded string, so that I can store the data right in the form of a string in my database. But that string is going to be a hashed string, not a plain text, right? So what is the step? Create an instance of the algorithm what you want to use, convert your password to byte array, compute the hash of that byte array, and once you compute the hash, then convert that hash to base 64 string. So this method will take the plain input, plain text of the password and will return the hash based right string of the password. And this is the verify method, what exactly it is doing. So you can see it is taking the hashed password which is stored in the database and the provided password which is going to be in the form of a plain text, right? So in this case, what exactly it is doing? Now internally, whatever the password right, plain text you are getting from the client, it is calling this password method, right? Basically to this method. So this method will convert this password into a hashed password, and that hashed password it is going to compare this password you will get from the database. So this database password and this generated password, if you both are matched or not. If you both are matched, it is going to return true, else it is going to return false. This method is clear.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Okay. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my DB context. So basically, right, for performing the operation, so I might store this updated user entity data into the to my file because I have added right to one more property. Yes, is active is there. Okay, fine. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to create my DB context. So within the DB context, I need to register my DB set properties. Within the DB context for testing purpose, whatever the master data, I mean role master, user master, those are I'm going to provide. Also, I'm going to specify that right one to many relationship between right user and role. Also, I'm going to specify this is going to be my right what this is going to be my composite primary key. And all this thing, right, I generally prefer to use right event-based approach. So let's do the same thing here. First of all, in my user role entity, I want to use a composite primary key. And we have already discussed what method I need to use, Haj key, and whatever all properties you want to use, right, to create the composite key, that property you need to specify here. In this table, it is going to create a composite primary key based on this user ID and role ID. Here you can see it is mentioning the one-to-many right relationship between user and user roles, and also one-to-many between role and user roles. So this user roles and their roles. So basically, what exactly it means? One user can have a multiple role, and one role can be assigned to multiple users. So technically, this is nothing but your right many-to-many relationship. So many-to-many relationship. Alternatively, you can call two one-to-many relationship. If you take the right from the user table, one user can have a multiple role, that is one to many. If you take the example from role to user, one role can be assigned to multiple users. That is also one to many. So many to many relationship means what? Two one to many relationship. So here one to many relationship, and here also one to many relationship, right? Then I'm inserting three right initial dummy role. You can say admin, administrator, manager, user. I'm also specifying some dummy user. You can see ID 123, and most importantly, you can see this is my email name, and the password you can see. I'm not storing the plain text, and for the password, I'm calling this a hash password method. And whatever the plain text password, that what I'm passing so that it can return me the hash based string, and that's what I'm storing here. Clear? Clear?
Yes.
Right? And here I'm storing some right user role mapping. So for user one, right, I'm assigning two role ID one and two. So for user role one means for user one Pranay. For Pranay, I'm assigning admin and a manager. For user role ID two, only one role, that is one. User two, John. John is going to be admin. For user three, I'm assigning two and three. Three is Jen Smith, which is going to be manager and a user. So different roles I'm providing so that I can test a different scenario. And this is going to my product entity. Here you can see I'm adding three domain product, and I'm specifying my DB set entity so that the tables are going to be generated in the database. Clear? This DB context class is clear? Clear or not?
Yes.
Right? And one important point that is active I'm adding here because I'm adding this new property later. So we also need to do the same changes here. Okay. So each active means the user is created with the active. Right. Let's do one thing. Right. Let's make this one false. Let's assume one user is not active. Okay. Clear till now? Anyone having any question? Till now we have not touched the authentication part. Clear? Is that clear, guys?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Now we are going to create our DTOs, which we can use perform the CRUD operation on the product entity. So I'm going to perform insert, update, delete, get. So basically for retrieving the data, we want one response DTO. For creating a new product, I want a creative product DTO. For updating the product information, I want an update DTO. So total how many DTOs I'm going to create? First of all, there is a issue. This application DB context should created within the data folder, not within the right what I can say DTOs folder. So it should be created within the data folder, right? So that's what I'm creating also. Okay, now within this DTOs folder, I'm going to create my class file. So create product DTO. First of all, let me create the DTO which I can use to create a new product. So you can see for creating a new product, you can see ID name, description, price stock. So ID that is going to be generated automatically. So I need to pass these four properties: name, description, price, and stock. The second one is update product DTO. So in update product DTO, along with these four properties, I also need the ID. Why? Because based on the ID, I'm going to update the product. So five properties are going to be there: ID, name, description, price, and stock. But most importantly, you can see these properties, I make them as optional. What is the meaning? The meaning is if the value they have provided for these properties, this validation will come into the picture. If they do not provide the value for these properties, then those properties are not going to be updated into the database, right? So how you can do this thing, I will show you. So what is the point that what you need to remember? Now, while updating the data, it is not needed, it is not mandatory that the user, the client should have passed all the properties value. If they only want to update the name, they can only pass ID and name. No need to pass a description, price, and stock. At what we are going to manage within our application code. And this is the reason why I'm making all these properties as nullable type. Clear? But if they are providing, then this validation will come into the picture. If they are not providing, if this property value is null, then this validation will never come into the picture. Clear? But in case of a create product DTO, These are not nullable type. It is mandatory to provide these properties mainly. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Okay. So final one is going to my product response DTO. So let me create one data class file. So whatever the product data you want to return, that data, right, either after creating, after updating, right, whatever the data or get all, get by ID. So whatever data you want to return, you are going to return by using this product response DTO. So our model is for internal architecture database structure DTO for exchanging the data. So now I want to perform the CROD operation on which entity? Product entity. So for that purpose, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create one service interface and one service class. So let me start with my iProduct service interface, which is going to define the right signature of the method. Uh, right, let me go ahead and here I'm defining all the signature. I mean, whatever all of method right operations you are going to perform on the product entity, I want get all async, get by ID, create async, update async, and delete async. So these are the operations, these are the methods, or you can say these are the different five operations that what I'm going to perform on the product entity. And finally, I need to create the implementation of this service. So let me create one class, and this class is going to implement iProduct service interface, right? So let me proceed and show you the implementation part. So in this case, you can see how it is going to structure. So first of all, I need to inject my DB context. So using this context, I'm going to perform and initializing that construct of the constructor. So the dependency injection container or the framework will take the responsibility to inject the context object, right? So this is mapped to DTO. So basically what exactly it means, like whatever the product object, it will map to this product response DTO. Why I'm using? Because I want to map this product to product response DTO at multiple places. So I'm creating this private helper method so that I can use this map to DTO method multiple times without repeating this mapping logic in my application code. So basically, this method will take one product entity and it will return one product response entity. So here ID name description price tag, they're going to be mapped. So if you want, you can make use of mapperly here, but we are not integrating mapperly. So now this is my get all async method. Simply it is returning all the products. And here you can see for each product, it is calling this map to method so that it will return me this product response DTO for every product. So what exactly this select and to this method means what? Now select means what? Now it is a projection method. So selected technically you can consider this is a for each loop. So whatever all products are there, this select method will access all those product one by one, and for each product it is calling this method by passing that product. And this method is going to return me product response DTO, and as it is a select, as it is a for loop, so finally it is going to return me a list of a product response DTO, and that what I'm going to return from this method. Clear? Clear, guys? This logic is clear, or should I simplify this right in a right easy to understandable manner?
Yes.
Clear, clear.
Okay. So this is my get by ID method. So one object. So I'm using find async. So what is the difference between find async and faster default? Can anyone tell me?
Find is on primary key, sir. So
Exactly. So and second thing, is there any scope of improvement in this query?
no tracking we can use.
Yes. So basically these are read-only operation. So happily you can make use of no tracking. Right? So these are read operations. So read operation means you can apply no tracking. But you cannot apply no tracking, right, when you are using this finder. So what I need to do here, I can make use of faster default async. Clear? And for faster default async, you cannot specify, right, what I can say. You cannot specify this value directly. So here you have to use lambda expression product such that product.id equals to this ID. Clear? Clear, guys?
Pranay, I have one question.
Yes.
So why we can't use as no tracking for the find method?
See, that find method is basically going to make use of, right, the change tracking in it, right, entity framework code.
Partially, am I?
See, change tracking means what? Now, once the context object is created, if some data is retrieved from the database, it is creating one snapshot. And whenever you are using a find method to find a particular record, it is going to check whether that record is already available within the context object or not. If it is available, it will return from that only, right? But and in that case, change tracking is mandatory. Tracking that object is mandatory. So if you are using find method, and
Okay.
while as no tracking is completely opposite. As no tracking means what? This object is never going to be tracked by the context object. So as both are contradicting each other, as no tracking explicitly specifying, I don't track this object. Find async method explicitly specifying track this object. So as both are contradicting each other, so you cannot use as no tracking and find async in the same query. Clear?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is going to my create async method. So I'm getting the DTO. I'm converting that DTO into my entity and finally adding that entity into the context object and calling the step changes method. So once I call the step changes method, then this product entity that whatever the newly generated ID, that is also going to be assigned by the context object. And then I'm converting that product object to a DTO. And this is my object async method. If you look at this object product, so apart from this ID, rest of all properties are optional. So how it is going to handle, please observe. First of all, in this case, you can see here I can make use of find async. Why? Now, once it finds the context object, right, whether from the context or whether it is retrieving from the database, now this object is being tracked. Now the object is being dragged. Dragged means what? Now within this object, if I am doing some operation, right, on this particular object, if I am modifying anything, if I am deleting this product, right, then this is going to be tracked by the context object. And when you call the reference method, either it is going to execute the object query or delete query, whatever, right, based on the operation. So first of all, find async I'm using means 100% it is going to be a dragged object. But if I'm using as no tracking, that is not going to be a dragged object. So here I can make use of a find async method. So the object is being tracked. So once the object is tracked, so first of all, I need to verify whether whatever the ID the user is specified, whether that ID for that particular ID, any object exists in the database, yes or no. So that validation I need to check. If the product exists, that's fine. If not exists, I can return false. That means update operation failed. Now, so once the object is available, then I need to update the properties. But which properties I want to update? Now, those properties which contains value. If this name contains value, then only I need to update. If description contains value, then only I need to update. If name is null, description is null, do I need to update? No, you don't need to update. So that's what I'm checking. If name is not equals to null, then only update the name. If description is not equals to null, then only update name. As name and description, right, are string type, you can make use of this not equal to. But at the same time, you can see this price, this stock, they are not string, they are integer type, right? Integral type. The integral type means what? Now you have to use this hash value property. So if this price has a value, if it is not null, it will return true. In that case, whatever the value, that's what I'm going to set in the price. If stock having a value, that's what I'm going to save in the stock. Right? And finally, I'm calling this step changes method. And this object is currently tracked by the right context object. And if any of these properties have been changed, and whichever properties are changed, only those properties are going to be updated in the database. Nothing but it is going to improve the application performance. And finally, once the update operation is completed, you need to return. Clear? Clear, guys? For example, if they have not provided name or if they have not provided description, then in the update query, this name and the description will never come into the picture. Only those properties are updated, and that is true. Whatever the new value, that must be a different value than the existing value. Then only that operation is going to be performed. So finally, this is going to my delete statement, which is going to find again. You can say I'm using find async, and it is going to check whether the product exists. If it exists, then it is going to remove and finally call the save changes method. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So till now we have done only the basic part, right? Now, if you create one controller, you can call this service method, and it will perform your application as expected. That's what we will discuss in some time. So before that, what is our main objective? Our main objective is to implement basic authentication, right? To implement basic authentication. So to implement the basic authentication in ASP.NET Core Web API, what we need to do, we need to create one authentication handler. So basically, we need to create one handler class, which is going to be inherited from the authentication handler class. So basically, when I'm saying authentication handler means we need to create a custom class that must be inherited from the authentication handler class. So within this basic authentication handler class, what we need to do? We need to implement our core logic. Sir, what logic we need to implement? Within this class, we need to write the logic which should read the authorization header value from the HTTP request. Once it read the authorization header value, it should decode that value, get the right username and password. Once it gets the username and password, it should check whether this username and password are valid or not, right, in the database. If the username and password are invalid, return authentication failed response, right? If this username right, it is not going to return authentication failed. So basically, if the username and password are invalid, so it means this is not a right. That means the HTTP context, right? What I can say technically. Now, technically, right here, when a request comes to our application, when a request comes to our application, so our application wants to know whether that request coming from a right identity user or a valid user. For that purpose, technically internally, it is going to set something called HTTP context.user. I will show you this thing practically. HTTP context.user, or which is also called as right what I can say uh, claims principal, right? Claims principal. So this HTTP context user object it is going to create internally, right? But it is only going to create the HTTP context user internally if this credential are valid in the database. If not valid, then in that case, it will consider that it is a anonymous user, not a valid user. Valid or right, anonymous user means it is not a bad user. Anonymous user means this is right an invalid user, right? So I will show you this thing practically how this HTTP context user is going to be created. But let now, so it is going to verify whether the username and password are correct in the database. If the username and password are correct, then it is going to load the associated claims from the database, right? So it will load whatever all roles are associated for that particular user. And once it right load, then it is going to create some object. One, it is going to create the claims object. It is going to create the claims identity object, and it is also going to create the claims principal. So this claims principal is nothing but right. It is going to be your HTTP context.user. What is the relation, right? I will show you all this thing in some time, right? For the authenticated user, if the user is authenticated, these things are going to be populated. If the user is not authenticated, then the right that HTTP context is going to be set as anonymous user, not a authenticated user. Anonymous user doesn't mean it is a bad user. Means this user is not validated, because sometimes we need a authenticated user. Sometimes anyone can access your services. If anyone can access, then in that case, this identity, this HTTP context user concept will never come into the picture. I'll show you all this thing practically, right? So once it load the roles from the database, then three things it is going to create internally. What are the thing? Claims, claims identity, claims principal. Sir, what is claims identity, what is claims principal, what is HTTP context to that user, what is the relationship between them, all these things we are going to discuss in some time, right? So once this is done, then it is going to create one authentication ticket when the authentication succeed, right? And return authentication failure when credentials are valid. So basically, it is not going to tell, right, whether authentication is failed or authorization is failed. It is simply going to tell the framework, ASP.NET Core framework, that the user is a authenticated user or the user is a unauthenticated user. So it is going to tell authentication success or authentication failure. But again, within this class file, right, we also need to define if the authentication is failed. For example, authentication failed. If authentication failed, then I want to return a custom 401 error response. You don't provide the implementation, that's fine. Default error message will come, but the default error message doesn't make any sense. So basically, if the user authentication informations are invalid, then what error response I need to return? If the user is authenticated but doesn't have permissions to access the endpoint, then what custom error I want to return? That what also I'm going to define within this basic authentication handler class. So let me go ahead and create this class file. And technically now I'm going to explain all these things so that you will get the clarity. So let me go ahead. This is the heart of our basic authentication, guys, remember. So let me start step by step. So first of all, when you are going to create a basic authentication, you have to create a custom class. That class should be inherited from your authentication handler class. And here authentication scheme option going to tell what type of authentication you are going to use, whether you are using basic authentication, whether you are using bearer authentication, whether you are using cookies authentication, that what going to be specified by this authentication scheme. And in this case, this is going to my basic authentication handler. So you have to create a class. That class must be inherited from this authentication handler. Now this authentication handler provided some virtual method, right? And those virtual method we want to implement, right? So what are the virtual method it is provided? Okay. See. So in this case, right, you can see one challenge is there, another forward async method is there. So this method and here authenticate async method is there. So these three method we need to handle in our application, right? So let us proceed and this. So let me start with this method. So you can see this is the first method, this is the second method, another method is there. So this is not the complete code. Let me get the complete code from my project. Okay. Okay. So within this, this is the method, right? So you can see this is going to my constructor. This is the one method. This is another method, and this is another method. So here you can see I'm having three method. So what is the use of this handle authenticate async? What is the use of this handle challenge async? What is the use of this handle forbidden async? Let us try to understand. So this is the core method. This is the core method, or you can say this is the entry point for our basic authentication handler. When any authorized attribute is there, suppose one action method is there, that action method is decorated with the authorized attribute, then for that purpose, this method is going to execute. So this is the method you can say that is going to be executed by ASP.NET Core automatically when the controller action method required basic authentication. What this method is going to do, now the responsibility, it is going to authenticate the request, right? Whether the request is valid or not, it is going to authenticate. And after authentication, it is going to check whether the authentication is a success or authentication is failed. So basically, it is going to generate one authentication ticket, and that ticket is going to tell the framework whether the user is authenticated or not. But in this case, right, guys, remember at this point of time, when this handle authenticate async method is executed, it is not going to return any kind of error message. You have to remember. So, what is the use of this method? This method is going to check whether the user credentials are valid or not. If valid, it will tell the framework, yes, authenticate, this is a authenticated user. If not valid, it will tell the framework, yes, this user is not authenticated. But it will not take the decision to return 401 error message or 403 error message or whatever. So that is not the responsibility of this handle async method. So this handle async method simply going to check whether the user authentication informations are correct or not. I mean, the credential are valid or not. Then this handle challenge. See, guys, remember, challenge means what? Challenge means invalid credential. So when I'm saying challenge means unauthorized. Challenge means unauthorized. Unauthorized means what? Now, if the user provided credentials are invalid, if the user provided credential are invalid, then this method is going to execute, and this method going to return whatever the error message you want to return when the user is not provided the correct credential or provided the correct credential. And what about this forbidden? Forbidden means what? Now access denied. Access denied means what? Now user is authenticated, the credentials are valid, but whatever action method the user trying to access, for that particular action method, the user doesn't have permission based on the assigned roles. Whatever the roles associated with the user, but for those roles, the user is not allowed to access the particular action method. So in that case, we need to return this forbidden async. I mean, we need to return 403 forbidden. So this forbidden means 403 on a rate so technically 403 means forbidden. Forbidden means the user is valid, but he cannot access the resources due to permissions. 401 means what? Unauthorized, or you can say challenge, which means the credentials are invalid. Handle authenticate method, what exactly it is going to do? It is going to simply set whether the user provided credentials are valid or not. So let us proceed and understand this logic first. Right. See, first of all, in case of a basic authentication, the user should pass this authorization header with this basic right. This basic is nothing but your authentication scheme, and this is the base 64 encoded string, which is going to contain the username and the password. Right. So first of all, what I need to do, right? I need to check whether the request contains the authorization header or not. If the request doesn't contain authorization header, what I'm going to do, what this method is going to return, right? This method returning authentication failed. I mean, authenticate result fail means what? This authenticate result fail doesn't mean authentication fail. So that means the user is not provided any sort of information for which I can check and verify that authentication is success. So in this case means what? So when I'm returning authentication result that fail means what? That the user is not a valid user. I cannot create one HTTP context data user object. I cannot create a claims principal object. That's what it's simple as it is. Means the user is not authorized. Clear? Clear? So first of all, you need to check it should have the authorization header. If the authorization header is there, next what I need to do, I need to check what is the value associated with the authorization header. So that value I'm going to check. So if that value, right, again, that value, right, whether that value, I'm checking authorization header value data try first. So basically, right, I'm passing that value to a schema and a parameter. So for basic authentication, I need two things. What are the things I need? I need the schema, and this is going to be the parameter. So this authentication header value. So dot try parse will try to parse this value to its associated schema and to its associated parameter. If this basic is missing, if this parameter is missing, means what? It is going to return false, and I'm using not operator, so it is going to return authentication result fail. That is, I cannot create a right HTTP context user for this incoming HTTP request. Clear?
Yes,
Clear,
sir.
guys? And what is HTTP context user? What information it is going to store? We'll discuss in some time. But now just remember, right? If authorization header is missing, I cannot create the HTTP context.user object. If right, if I'm unable to parse this header value to its associated schema and parameter, then also it is going to tell that I cannot create an HTTP context user, right? And again, once it parse, then this value I need to check. This value must be basic. Sometimes what happens, now people are using basic authentication and they are passing bearer token. So bearer, then that means what? Now as I'm using this is as my basic authentication, then this scheme value must be basic. So that's what I'm checking here. If the this header value dot scheme, if it is not equals to basic, again also I'm saying I cannot create the context object. I mean the context user. I cannot create the HTTP context dot user, or you can say I cannot create the claims principal object. So if this header value is basic, then what I need to do? Then I need to decode this encoded string to its username and password. So how I can do this? First of all, whatever the parameter, this basic part is going to contain this value, parameter is going to contain this value. So I'm converting that parameter to its base 64, and from this base 64, I'm decoding the credential, and after so from this base 64, I'm getting the string. From the string I'm splitting that with this colon, so that right generally I'm going to pass the username and the password, right? Username colon password. So the first parameter is going to be my username, the second parameter is going to be my password. After splitting by using this colon, right, I need to check whether the length is not equals to 2. If the length is not equals to 2, definitely it should have 2 part, but if it is not equals to 2, then invalid. I mean, I need to tell that I cannot create a claims principal for this particular incoming request. If it is true, then the first part is going to my email. The second part is going to be my password. So I'm retrieving, I'm extracting the email and password from the encoded string. So once I have the user email and password, then what I need to do? I need to check right whether this user right having this, and also is active. So single or default async. So instead of single, I can also make user faster to anyone. Anyone is also fine. So basically, I'm checking if any user is associated with email is available and is active. User not found or user not found or inactive. So you should not tell this thing. You should tell either the user is not found or inactive for this email, right? So if there is no user, you have to return this message. Again, you need to tell I cannot create the right claims principal. Then if the user is fine, then what I need to do, I can get the password, then I can verify the password. So for that helper method we have created now, password helper verify password method. That's what I'm calling. So this is the plain password what I'm getting from the token, and the stored password hash that is available in the database. That's what I'm passing. If this is matched, that is fine. If not matched, then I'm also going to return this method invalid password or email. I'm not telling whether it is right. Right. So you said invalid password for mail. This is wrong. Invalid. So you need to tell invalid username or password, because right specifying this right directly doesn't make any sense. So basically, you should never tell that password is wrong. So you should tell either invalid username or password. Clear? So this is logging, right? This is login. For login, this is fine, right? For login, this is fine. So this is log, and this is what we are returning: invalid username and password. This makes sense. So once the right, if username and if the password are matched, then what exactly it is going to do? Now this right context that user, it also retrieve the associated roles. So the next step, we need to create the claims. So what are claims? Claims are nothing but user identification information. So additional information about the user. So each piece of information of a user is treated as a claim. So basically, whatever the user ID, whatever the user email, right, whatever the user roles, if any user name, right, any information, if you take into consideration, that information is nothing but a claim about the user, right? So if someone asks you what are claims, so you need to tell claims are nothing but the information about the user. Then the question that should next question you should get, that's fine. But why we are storing claims into the right identity? So why we are storing this claims information into the claims principal object, or you can say into the identity, or into the HTTP context dot user. See. So if I'm not storing this claim information, at a later point of time, if I need to verify what role is associated, what is the user ID, what is the username, then in that case, I need to get the data from the database. Why should I get the data from the database? If I store the data into the HTTP context dot user object itself, I can access those data throughout the application, throughout the request. So that is the reason why. So it is generally recommended to store minimal information, right, which are required for identification, right? It is not mandatory in that in our basic authentication, but in token-based authentication, it is mandatory to store the minimum right or the required user information. Again, which are not sensitive. Don't store password. Password is sensitive. You should never store password into the claim. So claims are nothing but you can consider user-related information that what you want to store within the HTTP context object. And again, a user can have a multiple claims. So what I need to do, I need to create one array. So here you can see I'm creating one collection. You can create an array or collection claims. So minimum first I'm doing. Now what is the user ID? That what I'm storing within a custom name identifier. Whatever the user email, that what I'm storing in the name claim. So basically this is this claims. It is going to store the data in the form of a key value pair. That key is going to be this one string name, and that value is always going to be string. So in this case, you can see our name identifier is the claim. That value is going to be this one. Name is a right claim, and that email is going to be the value. Apart from this, any additional claim you want to store, you can also store. For example, I want to store the right what I can say for user. You want to store that right full name. So can I store that? Yes, you can store. So how you can do this thing, right? For example, I can create one claim. So here I can say full name, user dot full name. So this is how you can also create the custom claim. So any built-in identifier you can use. And if you go to this one, whatever all built-in identifier, right, claims types are available, those you can use, right? If we write email, gender, right, DNS, name identifier, phone, anything. If you don't want this thing, you can create your custom name like this. So this here, what I'm storing the name. I mean the ID, user ID, email, and the full name. Name you can whatever name you want. You can use existing name or you can give custom name. Is that clear? Yes or no?
Yes.
Clear,
Yes.
guys? Okay. So, but again, guys, remember. So this claim is fine, but to implement role-based authentication, if I want to identify whether the user can access that particular request after authentication, then what information I need? I need the roles, yes or no, whatever
Yes.
associated roles. So that's what I need to do. Then where I can store those roles? Again, those roles you can also store as part of this claim. So basically here you can see what I'm doing. right? I'm fetching all the associated roles, even, right? Even if you want, while loading this data, you can also load. Otherwise, you can also load the right associated user roles here, right? I'm fetching all the roles where this user ID, including the role name, right? Role and role name. And here what I'm doing now, once I got all the role names, because the role, so I need to join, right? What exactly it means. So while I'm loading the user roles, I'm also loading the associated role. From this role table, I'm getting the role name, right? And I'm looping through all the role names. So one by one, I'm looping through. And here you can see I'm adding a claim. So what type of a claim I'm doing here? I'm creating a new claim object. So new claim. So you can see new claim I'm creating. And here the right key is going to be role and the value is going to be role. So like this, right? I can add all the role claims to my right to my claims array. So basically here I'm storing the basic claims information. I'm fetching all the associated roles for this particular user, and then I'm storing all those roles to the same claims collection. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right? So claims means it is information about the user. Whatever information you want to store, you can store ID, email, right? Username, roles. All these are nothing but one claim. So now once the claim, you decide what all claims you want to store. The second step is to create a claims identity. Sir, what do you mean by claims identity? Now, the claims identity means it represents who the user is from the application security perspective, right? Which authentication scheme is being used for this particular identity. So, what red claims does this identity contain? So, claims identity means what? Now, it is going to store the list of claims, plus these claims are associated with which authentication scheme. So, for example, today we are implementing basic authentication, right? Today we are implementing basic authentication. Tomorrow we might be integrate, right? Another authentication like what you can say, JWT authentication. Then claims what I'm storing for the basic authentication might not be same for JWT authentication, because in case of a JWT authentication, that claim, that token I am returning to the client. So I might not store all the required information, but for the basic authentication, I might be store more information. Means what? Now, if you are integrating multiple kind of authentication, then for each authentication, you need to create one claims identity, and that identity is going to contain the list of all claims which are available for the specific authentication type. So in this case, scheme.name means what? It is going to return me the authentication type as basic. So in this case, this is going to be the authentication scheme. And in this case, the scheme is going to be basic authentication. And for basic authentication, what all claims are associated, that's what I'm storing here, and this is going to be a claims identity. Why I'm saying? Because this handler I'm creating for basic authentication. In the same way, I can also create another handler for cookie based authentication. I can create another handler for JWT based authentication, and for us, right, that HTTP context dot user is going to be one. It cannot create multiple user, but that HTTP context dot user should contain all the right claims identity for each type of authentication. So how it is going to contain? Now for that purpose, first of all, you need to create the list of claims. Then once you create the list of claims, then you can assign this list of scheme to a specific authentication scheme. In this case, basic authentication. This claims identity, nothing but it is going to contain two pieces of information. What information? What authentication scheme? Right? What authentication scheme authenticated the user? What authentication scheme is being used to authenticate this particular user? Basic authentication, JWT authentication, right? Here you can see that the scheme is going to be basic, it can be bearer, it can be cookies, whatever the authentication. And what claims does this identity contains? Does it contains the ID claim, it contains the name claim, it contains the roles claim, it contains the username. What claims it contains, right? Those informations are going to be stored within my claims identity. Clear? What is claims identity? claims identity, nothing but it is going to contains the list of claims plus what authentication scheme is being used to authenticate the user, whether it is basic, bearer, cookies, or anything else. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. Then once the claims identity is created, so you can create, right, multiple claims identity, right? One claims identity for the basic authentication, one claims identity for the bearer authentication, one claims identity for the cookies authentication. Right now we are having only one authentication, right? Only basic authentication. Tomorrow we are going to implement the JWT authentication. So bearer identity will come into the picture. So basically what I need to do, I need to create one claims principal object. Sir, what is claims principal object? Now, the claims principal object, right? It's nothing but it is a container. Claims principal object is nothing but it is a container of claims identity. So now we are having only one claims identity. That is what I'm going to store in my claims principal. Tomorrow I'm going to create another authentication handler for JWT. Again, another claims identity is going to be created. That is also going to be right stored within the claims principal. Claims principal is nothing but you can consider, right? It is a container for one or more identity. Clear? What is claims principal? It is a container for one or more identity. If your application uses multiple type of authentication, for each authentication, one claims identity is going to be created, and all those claims identities are going to be stored within a single claims principal object. Clear? Clear or not? Right. If you're not getting sick. First of all, what I need to do, I need to create a claims. Claims are nothing but your user information. Clear? So once the right user information is created, then what I need to do, I need to create one claims identity. Right? What this claims identity contain? It contains the claims and how the user authenticated. How the user is authenticated claims. How the user is authenticated means using basic authentication or using bearer authentication or using cookies authentication. Clear?
Yes, sir.
Clear or not? So
Yes.
similarly, let's assume we created some claims, user information or basic authentication. Again, right, I'm creating the same thing. And another handler is there that is going to be created for the bearer authentication. And here, this claims identity is created for this, right, whatever the is right claims and authentication mechanism, how the user is authenticated using this scheme. So basic is nothing but your authentication scheme.
Can application have multiple
I will show you now. Currently, I'm implementing only basic authentication. Within this application, I'm going to implement also JWT authentication. So you will get right how multiple authentication will work within the same project. Clear? Clear?
Yes,
So now, how many claims identity are there? One claims identity, right? For the basic authentication, one claims identity for the right bearer authentication. Now what I need to do? I need to create a claims principal. Sir, what is claims principal? Now, claims principal, it is a container of claims identities. Container or claim identities. Clear? So basically, within this claims principal, right? Let I can store this claims identity. Let assume claims identity basic. Right? So this basic claims identity I can store any name you can give. Right? Whatever the name. So I can store here basic claims identity. I can also store here bearer claims identity. Clear? So what is claims principal? It is a container for identities, one or more identity container for one, at least one or more claims identities. Clear?
Yes.
Right? Clear? Clear or not?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
this claims
Yes, sir.
principal object, right? And this claims principal object is going to be assigned to one object of this HTTP context object that is going to be user. So technically, if you see this HTTP context dot user instance, this HTTP context dot user is nothing but it is going to be an instance of this claims principal. Clear?
Yes.
Yes.
Right? An instance of a claims principal. Then what HTTP context technically store? Technically, it is going to store a list of claims, whether the user right and how the user is authenticated, or whether they authenticated using basic authentication or bearer authentication. Clear? Clear or not? So now if someone asks you what is claims, you have to tell it is user information like email, ID, right, roles, whatever. So what is the claims identity? Now claims identity is going to contain the list of claims as well as how the user is authenticated, whether using basic authentication or bearer authentication. That is going to be contained within the claims identity. And in a single application, we can have a multiple claims identity, one claims identity for basic authentication, one claims identity for bearer authentication. Then how we can store all this information? Right now, for this purpose, we are going to create a container, and that container is going to be claims principal, and this claims principal container going to contain one or more claims identities, right? One claims identity for basic authentication, one claims identity for bearer authentication, and finally, that claims identity claims principal instance, right? Whatever the instance is created, that is going to be stored within the HTTP context user only, right? Only when the authentication is success. When the authentication state is success. So what exactly it means? Now it means, right? Now let's proceed further. So we created the claims principal. Clear till now? Step 11 is clear.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Right. Now it is once the claims principal is created. Now we need to tell the framework, right? We need to tell the framework. Framework means to whom? ASP.NET Core Framework. What we need to tell? We need to tell the framework, hey, Mr. Framework, the authentication is successful. I mean, the user identification is successful. The user is identified using basic authentication, right? The user is identified using basic authentication. So how we can tell this thing? Now, first of all, we need to create an instance of authentication ticket. And to this authentication ticket, I need to pass my claims principal. All right. And also I need to tell the authentication scheme. So basically this is going to tell the framework, hey, Mr. Framework, the user is authenticated or the user is identified using the basic authentication scheme, and that user's claims information you can access from this claims principal object, right? And how we can tell this thing? Once the authentication ticket is created, just call the success method, pass this ticket, that's it. So at this point of time, the user, right, the framework know that user is authenticated and how, right, and there is a property called user dot identity dot authenticated. You can see here I'm specifying this claims identity. Claims identity means it is going to store the list of claims, and it is also going to specify the schema using which the user is authenticated. And once the user is authenticated, right, that user dot identity dot is authenticated property is set to true, right? And again, that claims information whatever available, all these things you can access within the application. How? Now using the HTTP context dot user. So now once this statement is executed, whatever the claims principal we specified here, that claims principal, right, framework will assign to this HTTP context data user object. And from this user object, right, you can get, right, you can get all the claims informations. Clear?
The, for the authentication ticket, should we pass the
Yes.
scheme name again? Like, can we extract it from the claims principal, or is there a reason why we pass the scheme name again?
So this statement you are talking about, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
This authentication ticket, right, we are returning to whom? We are returning to the framework, right?
Okay.
So what we actually return to the framework. So this authentication result dot success, authentication result dot fail. It is going to tell, right? If authentication success means it is telling to the framework the user is identified, the user is authenticated. If I am returning fail, then what it will tell to the framework, the user is not identified. It is going to be a anonymous user, right? So as we are telling the framework that user is authenticated, then framework also needs to know if the user is authenticated, then how it is authenticated, using which scheme. So that what we need to specify, using which scheme the user is authenticated. Yes, you tell that this is the scheme, but if this is the scheme, then what all information is there within right available as part of the claims? Again, we need to pass the claims principal, right? So the claims principal contain all the claims information along with the identity, how the user is authenticated. Also, right, this scheme is also going to tell how the user is authenticated along with this claims. This claims principle means you can say all the associated claims related to the user. This scheme name means how the user is authenticated, right? So these two things we are by passing, we are creating the ticket, and this ticket we are returning to the framework. So once the framework return this ticket, right, the authentication ticket, from this ticket the user, right, the framework identify yes, the user is authenticated, right? How the user dot identity dot is authenticated is true, so the user is authenticated. Yes, if the user is authenticated, then how the user is authenticated? Yes, it is using the basic authentication. Okay, if the user is using basic authentication, then what claims principle are available? So that claims principle, right, it is getting from the first parameter, and that claims principle it is going to assign to this HTTP context dot user object. And again, this claims principle also contain how the user is authenticated, that is the basic authentication, how the right, what are all the associated, all this information you can access from this context user. Clear?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Right now. This is part, and now handle challenge async method. So this will come into the picture when the user is unauthenticated. When it will come to the picture, when it is going to be executed by the framework, I will tell you later, right, in some time. But now let us try to understand what this method is doing internally. So first of all, it is going to check if the response is started. I'm not going to make any changes to the response stream. If it is not started, I'm setting the response code as 401. I'm setting the content type as application slash JSON. This read response header I'm adding, which will tell the client that the application is using basic authentication. This is completely optional. If you don't want to use this one, that is fine. My API, any name you can give, that is fine. And finally, I'm preparing my anonymous object in the form of a .NET object. So what in the response you want to return? I want to return status code, error, and message. And finally, I'm writing that response, right? I'm converting that into JSON and writing to the response stream. So this method is going to return 401 unauthorized. So when this method is going to execute, I will tell you some in some time. The second one is the forbidden. So basically, again, if the response has not started, if the response is not set by anyone else, then only I'm going to set the response as 403, content type as application slash JSON, setting this response read JSON message, which is going to be shown to the client that status is 403, error is forbidden. You are not, you are authenticated, but you are not allowed. And finally, this red.NET object I'm converting to JSON and writing that JSON to the response stream. So this is going to be my right basic handler method. Clear?
Yes.
Okay. Now next what I need to do, I need to modify my connection string. So go to the app settings JSON file, specify where you want to create the database. So I need to give, I just need to remove the basic keyword. Any authentication database is there. So I'm giving the database name as authDB, right? So because I'm going to also integrate, right, JWT authentication. So naming convention should be specific. Database is going to be my authDB, right? So once this is done, the next step is very, very important. We need to register our basic authentication scheme challenge and required services and the middleware component. So let me update this one. So this is very, very important. So I'm not explaining what is this builder dot services dot add controller add JSON, which we have already discussed. I'm not going to keep focus on this DB context registration. I'm not going to keep focus on this add scope where I'm registering my services right to the dependency injection container. Now what I need to keep focus on the service registration. Now, so if you are working with any existing project, right, then you might be seeing this builder.services dot add authentication. So basically, what exactly this add authentication? Now, it is basically this add authentication is nothing but it is going to specify what is going to be your default authentication scheme when no authentication is specified. When no authentication scheme is specified, right, within the authorized attribute. Okay. So side by side, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create, I will explain this product controller in some time, but let me first create this one. Okay. Okay. Now tell me. So within this method, am I specified what type of authentication scheme I need to use? See, if you look at here, I'm specifying the authentication scheme as basic authentication. You can specify the authentication scheme as bearer authentication. You can specify the authentication scheme as a cookies authentication. But if I'm specifying those authentication scheme explicitly, that is fine. But if I'm not specifying the authentication scheme, then which authentication scheme will be used as the default authentication for your application? That's what you need to specify using this add authentication. So add authentication means it will register the authentication service and set the default authentication scheme. And right in this case, the default authentication is going to be a custom name. So you can give any name, and that is going to be your name of the authentication. So it doesn't mean you can give basic authentication. You can give my basic authentication also. It is fine. Clear? Clear?
Yes.
Right. So this will come into the picture when your authorized attribute doesn't have any authentication scheme specified. And this is going to specify a specific authentication. So here it is specifying the default authentication, and here we are actually registering a authentication. So basically here you can see I'm specifying the authentication scheme and the basic authentication handler. So basically, right, if you see that authentication scheme name is going to be basic authentication. So here, so this is going to my authentication scheme name, that is basic authentication, and whatever name I specified here, that name you need to specify here, right? If you specify this name, then for this particular authentication scheme, the corresponding handler will go coming into the picture. So using this authentication scheme is nothing but basic authentication, and for basic authentication, this is the handler that will come into the picture, and that name I'm specifying here. No additional information I'm specifying here. So this additional information means what? Now currently that things we are handling here. So we are setting the forbidden, we are setting the challenge, right? That challenge and forbidden we have set here. If you are not setting here, that what you can set here, but not recommended as per the industry standard. Wherever you defined your handler, there only you specify what is the right challenge, what you want to return in case of a 401, what you want to return in case of a 403. So basically, this is nothing but your registered a custom authentication scheme using its own handler. So in this case, the custom authentication scheme is basic authentication, and for this basic authentication, the handler which is going coming into the picture is basic authentication handler. Clear? Clear or not?
Yes.
Yes, clear, Pranay. But here you mentioned here in the add schema basic authentication. You mentioned that parameter as basic authentication, but above you mentioned my basic authentication. I think both should be same, right here.
No. So you are taking me wrong.
But here in the comment you mentioned like must match
Wait,
authentication above add authentication.
let me give you the clarity. So now, how many authentication schema I registered?
Two.
Two, right? So let assume, right, this is your basic authentication, and here you registered some JWT authentication. Clear? Now, as I'm having two authentication, if I specified here, right, if you come to this place, if I do not specify any authentication scheme, then out of these two authentication which we registered, which will be used as the default one?
Basic
So
authentication.
whatever you
Basic
specify,
authentication.
if you specified here basic authentication, then this basic authentication scheme means this handler will execute or handle your code. If you set here JWT authentication, then which one will come into the picture?
The second one.
Second one. Now, but here if you explicitly specify here, explicitly I'm specifying basic authentication. Here explicitly I'm specifying JWT authentication. Means what? Now for this particular method, this one will come into the picture, not the default one. For this one, this authentication scheme will come into the picture, not the default one. Default one is recommended, right? Because if you do not specify any authentication scheme, then which one will be coming to the picture as the default, right? That is what you need to specify using this one. So it is just a right authentication service registration specifying the default authentication scheme, and here you are explicitly specifying what all handler, right, are available, or what all authentication options are available for your application. Clear?
Yeah, clear. Yeah, thank you.
Right? So now let it be their basic authentication. Why? Because currently we don't have the JWT authentication. So once we register JWT authentication, again I'm going to do the same within this application. At that time you will get more clarity. So but now the basic authentication is the default authentication, and the basic authentication we have also registered here. And for the basic authentication scheme, the handler is going to be this one. Clear? So here, this scheme doesn't know whether it is using basic authentication or whether it is using JWT-based authentication. What is important? What is the name you provided here, and what is the corresponding handler? So if any authorized attribute, they are using this authentication scheme, means this authentication handler will come into the picture. It might be possible this handler, whatever you implement, it might be for cookies based authentication, it might be for JWT based authentication, it might be for basic authentication, whatever. So there is no right now. So that's what you need to understand, right? So here we are only specifying what is the authentication scheme name and what is the corresponding handler. Clear? Till now, is that clear? How to register our right basic authentication services with default basic authentication?
Yes.
Okay. Now, right, we need to understand these two, right? Use authentication and use right authorization. Many people have many right doubts. So first of all, because you guys are working with ASP.NET Web API, right? Old version, current version, right? Many working members are also here. Can anyone tell me what is the difference between these two middleware component? What is the responsibility of a huge authentication? What is the responsibility of a huge authorization?
Hi, Pranay. So I will take. So,
Yes, please.
yeah. So use authentication middleware is used to check whether given user is authenticated user or not. So for that, use authentication middleware is used, and use authorization middleware is used to check whether the authenticated user has the rights to access the endpoint.
So basically what you are saying, so it is going to check whether the user is authenticated or not, and it is
Yes,
going to check whether the user can access the resources or not. So if
yes,
the
yes,
user is not authenticated, so it will return, this middleware will return 401, and this middleware is going to return 403 if not authorized. Is that what you are trying to explain?
yes, yes, yes.
How many of you are agree with this explanation? How many of you agree and how many of you are disagree?
Agree.
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 Okay. So what exactly it means? Now my cross question is, if I don't want role-based authorization, then can I comment this one?
Yes.
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 Right? So for example, I don't need role-based access control. Can I comment this one? And right, and here my application is going to work as expected. Suppose I'm removing this roles part. I'm removing this roles part. Is my application is going to work as expected? Yes or no? So if what you are trying to explain that use authentication is going to validate the user whether the user is authenticated or not, and this is going to check whether the user can access or not. If I don't want that role-based access control, I only want to check whether the user is a valid user or not. Means what? That means I can comment this middleware. Clear?
Yes. Yes.
Yes or no? So let us comment and try to run this application and see. So before that, what I'm going to do, I need to generate my migration file. So whatever you explain, whether that is correct or wrong, let us first prove it. Then I will explain what is the correct explanation and what actually we generate. So whatever you are telling, that is what my thought of understanding when I start learning. No doubt about it. But whether that understanding is right or wrong, let us try to check. Let us see. Okay. So this is done. Let me run the application. So what I'm getting here,
Yes. An error.
okay, so let me pass a rate valid token. So how to generate the token? I will show you in some time. So let me first rate pass a valid JWT token. So even though I'm passing a valid JWT token, I'm getting this error. Right? Why? I'm passing a valid JWT token, but why I'm getting this error? See, let us try to observe. So actually what is happening? Actually, this middleware is not for valid, right? This middleware is not meant for doing all these things. So this middleware enables, right, what exactly it is doing. Let us try to observe. So at runtime, this middleware will come into the picture, whether your application action method, whether they are decorated with allow anonymous, whether they are decorated with authorize, whether they are decorated with authorize with authentication scheme, whatever, right? Whatever the scheme you specified here, right? Whether the action method decorated with authorize attribute or right, to allow anonymous or without any kind of authentication and authorization, whatever. This huge authentication middleware will come into the picture. What exactly this middleware is going to do, irrespective of authorized attribute, whether that is applied on the action method or not, this middleware will run. And this middleware, use authentication middleware, basically going to execute the default authentication scheme that what you specified here. So when it find the default authentication, and guys remember, within the service registration, you can only specify one default authentication scheme, not more than one. And currently, when it execute, it see that the default authentication scheme is basic authentication. So what exactly it is going to do? Okay, so default authentication scheme is basic authentication. Okay, for basic authentication, what is the corresponding handler? Yes, the handler is this one. So basic authentication handler. So within this handler method, so it is going to automatically that use authentication middleware is going to execute this handle authenticate async method. So once this handle authenticate async method is executed, and finally, what this method will return to the framework, it will return one authentication authenticated result or authentication ticket to the right framework, and that authenticated ticket is going to tell whether the user is a right valid user or not. So how it is going to return? Now it is going to return one HTTP context dot user, or you can say this claims principal. It will return to the framework, and this claims principal right to know whether the user is authenticated, if authenticated, how it is being authenticated, if authenticated, what are the claims associated with. That means that the HTTP context dot user, or you can say this principal, claims principal. Let's see, technically, if you see this HTTP context user, it's nothing but it is a claims principal, right? So if you go to any action method, right, HTTP context, you can see this is going to be a user, right? So here you can see what is the type? The type is a claims principal. And this claims principal, you can see it is nullable type. So when it is going to be null, when it is going to be not null, that basically define whether the user is right authenticated or not. If the provided credential are valid, the user is authenticated. In that case, right, that the object is going to populate the claims principal and all this data. If it is not validated, then this is going to be null. So basically, in this case, this authenticate right use authentication, it is going to check right whether the user is authenticated. I mean, it is going to execute the default right authentication handler, and that default authentication handler going to check whether the user is authenticated. If authenticated, it is going to set the HTTP context dot user object. That's it. This middleware never going to do any kind of authorize check, allow anonymous check, right, role based authentication. Nothing is going to be handled by this middleware component, right? So if you go, right, so what is thing adds the authentication middleware to the specified app builder, right, which enable authentication capabilities. The app builder to add right a reference to the instance after. So basically, this is what this middleware will do. So irrespective, right? For example, if you are saying, right, if I do not specify this allow anonymous, or I do not specify any authorized attribute, if I'm accessing this component, does it mean it is going to execute this basic handle async method? Yes, 100% it is going to execute this one. If the user provided credential are valid, right? In that case, it is going to set the HTTP context to the user. If those credentials are invalid, then HTTP context that the user is going to be null. That's it. And that is for each and every incoming request, whether the request contains any authorized attribute or not, this middleware 100% going to execute this thing. Clear? What is the use of this user authentication middleware? It is going to authenticate the user. Clear? So the point that what you need to remember, this middleware doesn't block request, it only identifies the user. Clear?
Yes.
Clear. So once this middleware is executed, then what is the next middleware? The next middleware is user authenticator, right, or user authorization. So when this middleware execute, it is going to inspect the metadata about the HTTP endpoint. For example, it is going to execute this method get by ID. So it is going to check what all metadata are available for this endpoint. So metadata means what is the method name, what are the input parameter, what are all the associated attribute. If attribute authorized attribute is there, then is that attribute containing what authentication scheme, and if authentication scheme, right? If it is using any authentication scheme, then does it using any role-based access control, right? All these informations are going to be checked by the right middleware. Which right middleware? Use authorization middleware. Let me first copy this code. Okay. So basically, metadata means what? Metadata means what attribute are allow anonymous, authorize, authorize with rate authentication scheme, only authorize, or rate authorize with authentication scheme or roles, whatever all attributes are specified. So that what you need to check. So this attribute, right? This authentication, it is going to check two things. What are the things? First, HTTP context user. Second, what all rate authorization related attributes are associated with the HTTP request. So based on this, it is going to take the decision. So what exactly it is going to do? So it is right once this authentication middleware starts, it is going to check, does this endpoint decorated with authorized attribute? Yes, it is decorated with authorized attribute. So what authentication scheme it is being using? It is using basic authentication scheme. Is basic authentication scheme is the default one? Yes, it is the default one. Okay. If basic authentication scheme is the default scheme, and if the endpoint using this basic authentication scheme, okay, let me check, right? Whether the user is a authenticated user or not. In that case, it will check this HTTP context.user, and if this HTTP context.user identity dot is authenticated is true. So what I'm saying now, HTTP context, right? So here you can see HTTP context dot user dot identity dot is authenticated. So this is going to return me some boolean value. Boolean, right, is authenticated. Clear? So basically, right, if HTTP context that user is not null, identity is not null, right, it is going to return true. So in this case, this use authorization middleware, it will check, yes, basic authentication scheme is used, and basic authentication is the default scheme. So it is directly going to check, right, this HTTP context dot user dot identity dot is authenticated. If that is true, means user is authenticated. So once that is checked, right, user is authenticated, then this middleware is also going to check, does it uses any role-based access control? Yes, it is uses role-based access control. What is the role? Administrator. Then again, this it is going to check HTTP context dot user dot claims principal, right? So it is going to check what all claims are associated. So out of these all claims, whatever claims is required by this action method administrator, does administrator claims available in the claims principal? Yes, it is available. Okay, let me give access. Okay, user is authenticated, right? And that it will give access. Now let us try to understand the negative scenarios. So basic authentication is specified, but here the context HTTP context dot user dot is authenticated is false. Means what? User is not authorized. Is not authenticated. The user is not provided valid credential. If that is authenticated is false, then what exactly this middleware is going to do? Now, in this case, it will check what is the authentication scheme, basic authentication. For basic authentication scheme, what is the handler? This is the handler. Then for this handler, right, what is the challenge method is defined here. It is defined handle challenge async. So this method it is going to execute, and whatever the response it return, that what it is going to return to the client. Now let assume user is authenticated. Let assume the another scenario. User is authenticated. but the permission is not allowed. So the user is authenticated having the role manager. The action method which is trying to access required admin role. So in that case, user is authenticated, but permission is not allowed. So in that case, what exactly it is going to do? It is going to execute the forbidden async method, right, of the handler, which is going to return this error response to the client. Clear? Now, is that clear? Clear or not?
Yes, sir.
Clear, guys?
Yes.
Now, sometimes what happens that the basic authentication is this one, but my controller action method decorated with the JWT based authentication. So it required JWT authentication. Then in that case, what will happen? So in that case, what will happen that this huge authorization middleware will ask, right? Right, it is going to check what is the default authentication scheme, basic authentication. And for this particular action method, what authentication scheme is decorated? JWT authentication. Okay. So the authentication scheme is different. Okay. Let me check for JWT authentication, right? Right. For JWT authentication, what is the corresponding handler? Okay. This is the handler. Okay. Let me execute that handler sync method. Once that handler sync method is executed, what that method is going to set? It is going to set HTTP context dot user object. Again, the remaining flow is going to be same. So if the default one is the one which is specified here, then it is going to use the HTTP context dot user object directly. If the default authentication scheme and the scheme what we specified here are different, then in that case, it is going to execute that corresponding authentication handler, which is definitely going to set the HTTP context dot user object. Then it is going to start its processing, right? Whether the user is authenticated, what is the if not authenticated, return 401. If authenticated, check the roles. If role permissions are allowed, okay, let me execute the action method. Not allowed, okay, let me return 403 error message to the client. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So this is how right you need to create. And this is going to my product controller. You can see I'm not doing anything special. So the simple logic calling the service class method for doing the operation. But here, right, what is important to understand, guys? So different ways to use authentication. So let me show you. So basically, I want to show you 5 different approaches. So some of the endpoint I don't want to provide any kind of a control. Anyone should access some public endpoint. If such endpoints are required within your application, you can decorate those endpoints with allow anonymous. Allow anonymous means what? Now, in this case, when this huge authentication middleware execute, it will check what attribute is decorated. Okay, allow anonymous. Allow anonymous means what? It will completely skip the authentication and authorization steps. Directly, it is going to execute the action method. Clear? So what is happening if a action method is decorated with allow anonymous? In that case, the use authorization middleware will completely skip the authentication and authorization steps. Clear? Clear or not?
Yes.
Right? Endpoint with basic authentication only. So if you want one endpoint which must be accessed with basic authentication, but I don't want to check the role, I just want to make sure the user is a valid user, then in that case, what you need to do, you only need to specify the authentication scheme. That's it. And in this case, it is only going to check whether the user is authenticated or not. It is not going to check the authorization step. That is going to check the claims, and it is going to verify what claims is required to access this action. Those steps are going to be skipped. Simply, it is going to check whether the user is authenticated or not. The third one is endpoint with role-based basic authentication. Now, I want one endpoint which must be accessed by admin user, which must be accessed by rate manager, which must be accessed by normal user. Then in that case, I need to specify the roles, right? So I need to specify the roles. Roles means what? You can see the roles is going to be administrator. So only the user, once the authentication is done, If the user having the role administrator, then he can access this endpoint. Otherwise, he will get 403. Clear? So how to specify authentication with right role? Clear or not?
Yes, sir.
Clear or not? Okay. Now sometimes what happens, now multiple endpoint with multiple roles. So sometimes what happens, now some of the user are having admin role, some of the user are having managerial role, some of the user are having normal user role. Multiple user are there. So now what we want to do is, I want one action method, right, which can be accessed by admin role or by the manager. If the user is a admin, he can access, or if the user is a manager, he can access, right? Then how we can specify such thing? Now in that case, you have to use the role attribute, role property, and specify multiple roles separated by comma. So here, if the user is a role, or see here the condition is or condition. If the user having this role or both role, he can access this one. So here we are only checking if one of this role is assigned to the particular user, then he can access the endpoint. Clear? Clear or not?
Yes.
Right. And finally, if someone wants, no, I want the and condition. If the user having both the role, then only he can manage, right? For example, he should have the administrator role as well as the manager role. Then in that case, right, you need to specify multiple authorized attributes. So or condition, you can specify multiple roles separated by comma, and condition means you have to specify multiple authorized attribute like this. Clear? And in this case, if you do not specify this authentication scheme, then also it is going to work. How it is going to work? In this case, that default authentication scheme will come into the picture. Clear? So for example, I'm removing this one. So in this case, that default authentication scheme will come into the picture. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So this is how you can specify the uh, different way, right? The basic authentication, role-based authentication, all this you need to specify now. Now we want to test the functionality. So first of all, I need to create the base 64 encoded string. So you can visit this application. So to this application, what you need to do, you need to specify your username and password separated by comma. So you can see John Dio example.com. All right, if you look at this application, right, authentication DB database. So auth DB, so tables. So this is my users table. So this is my John Dio. So this is my username, colon, and whatever the associated password. Password you can see it is storing in the hash form. So how you can get the password? Go to the UpDB context. And for John Dio, what is the password? Password is John at the rate 123. So that's what I'm copy and paste it here. All the encode method. So which is going to create my base 64 encoded string. So this is going to be my encoded string, right? And that encoded string I need to specify here using the basic scheme. So that's what I specified. And this is my endpoint, right? Now let us proceed and test the endpoint. So get product, right? So get product, this is one endpoint. So does this get product endpoint require any authentication? So this get all, does it require any kind of a basic authentication or JWT or anything? So allow anonymous means anyone can access, right? So here I'm specifying this is API product. And if I do not specify this authorization attribute, it should work. I should get the response. See, I'm getting the product details. So now the second method is that, right, you can see basic authentication application ID. Now, if you look at this get by ID, so it only required a basic authentication token. No, doesn't matter what roles the user have, only a valid authentication token. So now what I'm doing here, I'm specifying the ID one, and this time I'm not specifying the authentication. See whether I'm getting that or not authenticated. Yes, 401. Now I'm specifying the token. What I'm getting? Please observe. I'm getting the output. That means it is working. Clear? Clear or not?
Yes.
Now I want to create a product, right? So let me go ahead and specify my JSON object. And here, let me remove this one, and the endpoint is going to be post, right? So now I want to create a new product. So for creating a new product, right, what type of authentication is required? Admin role is required, right? And here, the user two, what instance we have created, this is user two, and this user ID 2. This user ID 2 is associated with what role? 1. 1 is administrator, yes. That means this user can create a new product, yes or no? Yes or no?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So let me first, without passing the token, I'm sending this one. So authentication failed. I'm passing the token, I'm executing, and you can see new product is created. So that's fine. So next controller is right. You can update, and here I need to pass both admin and the managerial role. Right, both role is right. Any one role is required. Right, either admin or manager. Right. So let me do this thing again. In this case, this user having the admin role. So right, he can right perform the operation. So let me pass the ID. So ID I'm passing here, and here I'm passing that ID in the route data. So now it should perform the update operation. Method not allow. Yes, it should be a put request and it should draw unauthorized. So it is saying unauthorized. Why it is saying unauthorized? Let us try to observe 401 unauthorized. I'm passing a valid token. Right, admin, setter and manager, basic authentication handler. What is the default authentication scheme? Basic. Okay, let me execute. I'm missing anything? Okay, let me specify the authentication scheme and see whether that is going to be work or not. Okay, so that scheme we need to specify. Even I'm not sure, right, why it is not working. Ideally, it should work, right? It is right. It is giving the 4204. Now, lastly, I want to delete the user. And for deleting the user, right, I need to send a delete command. And for deleting the user must have both a admin and a managerial role, right? And here, both role is required. But for this particular user, right, only one role is assigned. So this delete operation means it should return me what's ideally according to our requirement, right? According to our implementation, this should return what status code. Guys, tell me.
Okay, no content.
Why okay no content? So
I
first of
think
all, tell me.
unauthorized.
Unauthorized. Why? Because this user having role 2. Role 2 is nothing but manager. And for this action method, I need
We
both role.
require both roles. Yes.
Right? That means if both role means what? Whatever the credential we are passing, that is valid. But for that purpose, whatever role is required, right? Both roles are required and which is not assigned. So ideally, it should return me 403. So am I getting 403?
Yes.
Clear? But I'm not sure one thing why it is not working. Ideally, whatever the default authentication scheme we specified here, that should come into the picture, right? When I do not specify any authentication scheme attribute. But I'm not sure, right? When I'm removing this authentication scheme, why it is not working.
Maybe if we are mentioning role, then we have to mention scheme.
Okay, let us put this. So I'm not specifying this, right? Anything in the get by ID method, right? Let me run this one and see whether it is working or not. Get method. Yes, it is working, right? But if I'm specifying roles, then I think it is mandatory, right? For example, let me give one role. Now it is working. Why it is not working with this one? Why it is working? Even I'm not sure why it was not working at that time. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Yes.
Right? So if you do not specify any authentication scheme, then this default one will come into the picture. So this is how basic authentication is working. Now, anyone having any question, right, related to basic authentication? What is claims? What is claims identity? What is claims principal? Right? What claims principal is containing? Right? What is HTTP context dot user? What HTTP context dot user is containing? Anyone having any question, they can right ask me. Even those question and answer I have also provided here. If you have a look, then you will also get the clarity. Right? Three things. What is the use of authenticate method? What is the use of a challenge method? What is the use of a forbid method? Authenticate, it is going to create the identity user. Challenge, it is going to check 401. Forbidden, it is going to check whether the user is allowed to access the endpoint or not. Clear? What are claims? Claims are facts about the user. Store as a key value pair, such as name, email, user ID, roles. What is identity or claims identity? Identity represents who the user is from the application security perspective. Identity represent one authenticated result, right? In ASP.NET Core, usually it is a claims identity. It answers the question: is the user is authenticated? If authenticated, which authentication scheme is being used to authenticate the user? What all claims are available for this user? Right? What is claims principal? It is a container of one or more identity, right? And what is HTTP context user? The HTTP context user represents the current requested user, right? If the user is authenticated, then who the user is, what all claims are associated, and whether the user is a anonymous user or not, all these informations are going to be provided by user, right? If the user is authenticated, then how it is authenticated, what are the all the claims, right? All this information. If it is not authenticated, that means if this object is not, that is going to be anonymous user, right? What is this use authentication method does? What is this right use authorization method does? It all these things I have provided. So whatever we discuss, the same thing you can also find from here. Clear, guys? Anyone having any question, they can ask
Yes.
me now. Right. So this is all about our basic authentication. No session tomorrow. Right, day after tomorrow, we are going to discuss JWT authentication, right? That is very, very interesting, very, very important. And why? Because in this case, guys, remember the downside of this authentication is in each and every request we are passing the credential, which is not a good approach. Second, if you want to use basic authentication, it is mandatory to use HTTPS protocol. Third, if the authentication token, right, whatever the authorization header we are passing, if someone get that header, then they can easily decrypt that red string and they can get the username and the password, which is not secure. So, according to the real-time application, again, right, every time it receives the request, it is making use of a database to validate, to verify whether the user is a authenticated user or not, which is also going to take more time. So, all these things we can overcome using JWT, or you can say token-based authentication. That is what we are going to discuss day after tomorrow. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Okay, so this is how it is working. I hope, right, whatever question you guys are being asked from the beginning, I'm able to clear all the queries. If anyone having any queries, they can ask me now.
Pranay, I have one question.
Yes, yes.
Pranay, can we get this recording of these videos, recording of this session, so that we can
See,
explore further more?
recorded sessions are only for the, right, what I can say, enrolled member. Right,
Okay.
people are also attending the live session, right, paying money. It is only for the thing. Right? If I'm making everything free, then no one is going to join my live sessions, right? So,
Okay.
yes,
Yeah. I can understand.
understanding the concept, I'm making some important sessions are free so that anyone can attend the session, understand the concept. But the source code, right, document, videos, these are specific for the enrolled members. Clear, guys? Anyone else having any more question?
So Pranay, I have one query here. So instead of passing username and password, can we use a directory group name?
Sorry?
So instead of passing username, particular username and password, can we use AD group name,
The
Active
group
Directory
name
group?
means what? Can you please elaborate?
Like if the application hosted in the same company domain, so we will use some service account or AD group as a user, right?
Anyone, see, basically what is important. Now, from my application, I'm passing a encoded string, and within the application, I'm going to validate whether that credential, what are the information that being passed from the client is valid or not. So, how you are going to implement the validation, it is up to you only. So,
I
whether you
think
are
he is asking about this single sign-on thing. So that comes under OAuth thing.
no, that is not possible with this basic authentication. That is completely right. That SSO is not possible with this basic authentication. So for that purpose, you are going to use right something called token-based authentication. The right you should have a specific right authentication server which will take the responsibility of generating the token. Right, that is SSO is completely different, right? In our coming days, I'm also going to cover that SSO part, right?
Okay, okay.
Right, but that is SSO is a different one. So where I discussed that SSO. I have discussed somewhere SSO. Yes. Right. So without SSO, you have to create multiple account. With SSO, sign in once and access all the applications, right? How it is going to be implement. I'm going to develop this complete application, right, in the live session. But for this purpose, UI is required. And once Angular we have covered, right, I will discuss this or I will develop this application. Complete application I'm going to develop, how it is implemented, SSO, two-factor authentication, right? Everything, right? Security was is very, very important. What I'm going to discuss.
Okay.
Clear, guys?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Anyone else having any more question? Okay. Thank you, guys. Good night.
Good night.